right, we are live. Hello everybody. Hopefully everyone can hear me. If you've got any problems with the sound, feel free to let me know. I am watching the chat. If you've got any questions, ask away. Like I said, it's kind of on my other monitor. Let me know how the music is. I can't hear it. I can only hear myself, which kind of sucks. I got to fix that in the next couple weeks. It's kind of boring to sit here and talk to yourself or talk to a screen, especially the chats are usually pretty quiet. So I'm hoping everyone speaks up this round. So I haven't done streaming in a couple weeks. Been busy. Xamarin Dev Summit. I'm doing some contracting. I'm in the web world quite a bit these days. It kind of sucks. Xamarin's kind of the true passion. Wish I was working on this stuff all the time. So I was working on a to-do app a few weeks ago, I guess almost a month ago now. And I'm going to park that for now, just because don't really need to work with that right now. I'm going to come back to that in a future date and do some upgrades to kind of where Shiny has gone since I started that app. So today I'll be starting a different app, which is kind of cool, and I'll explain that in a second. For those who have been asking about Shiny, I am working on a final release. I'm just kind of getting to the stage of testing out Bluetooth, which is obviously the biggest pain in the ass to finish. And then documentation. For anybody that's out there, I am looking for help with the homepage because it looks awful, like awful. So I would love some help. Anybody that wants to work on that, let me know. DM me on Twitter or whatever, and yeah, help a brother out. It sucks. And for today, what I wanted to do is get started on an app. Basically, because I do a lot of contracting, I'm kind of driving all over the place. Client to client, racking up the miles. The Canadian government likes to really track that stuff. Rightfully so, I guess. So what I wanted to do was build an app with, the traditional UI, map, etc. But really what I wanted to do was start fresh today and do some of the data models, work out some of the ideas that I want to do over the next couple of weeks, and see how this thing grows. And I'm going to do this in Xamarin Visual Studio for Mac. Hopefully this thing doesn't crash on me, but we'll see how it goes. So this app, I know there's probably a ton of these apps out there. I have checked, the App Store. I don't really care. That's no fun. Using something that's out there and paying for it, nah. So what I wanted to do was build in kind of the GPS tracking, speed, a little bit of geofencing, and all that cool stuff just to track the trips, and kind of use quite a bit of Shiny to get this going. So today what I'm going to do is I'm going to kind of just frame out the app and go over some of the features that I want to add to this sucker. So first things first, I have kind of a bare bones project. I've already created something wrong here too. This is kind of how I start out apps. Now usually I have a template, but today I figured since nobody really knows how I build apps, I'd start from scratch. So I'm going to create what I call my core library or my abstraction library, basically how everything works. So we'll call this core. This is a class library. Interesting that I've created a .NET standard library, yet this appears to be, it almost looks like an Android project, does it not? All right, well, so what I wanted to do was start making kind of the domain models for how this thing is going to work. So I figured, what's the bare bones things that we got to do is, a trip. What's a trip going to look like? So in terms of domain model, obviously start time. Let's make this date time offset. Start time. And I will mark this with an end time. It's obviously nullable. And start time, end time. I didn't want to put any totals in here, just because this is gonna have a lot of details to it. So we'll do something like a trip pane. Come on. Call it a trip ping. And obviously I need to put an ID on this guy too. Let's make that a good, because I like stuff to go across the pipe without issues. It's pretty quiet out there. Anybody working on anything cool Xamarin these days? For the 3 viewers I have right now. What's this called? Trip. And we'll give this an ID as well. Daytime offset contains like the time zone offset. So it's not the time zone, it's the number of hours off of Greenwich Mean Time. So for instance, where I am, it's -5 right now. So it's a good way of tracking it, just because, you know, you may go across time zones like I do. I have been on the West Coast where it goes back 3 hours. So it's nice to just have that time tracking. And then when you're looking at it in local time, and you can actually just say, put this in local time, and kind of does all that magic for you. If you haven't worked with time zones really suck. They really kind of kick you in the face very often. So we're gonna make this an offset as well, and we'll timestamp this. So what I'm making right now is just kind of the GPS ping that's gonna happen. So we'll make this double, and we'll say GPS latitude. And we'll create one for longitude. And yeah, that should be good for this guy. You know, one thing I hate when it starts adding the core namespace, because this is kind of the gold. Everything's going to center through this. This is an iOS project. I created as this .NET standard, and it's made it in Xamarin. Nice. Add new project. It's an iOS library. My bad. Okay, let me move these out. I'm just going to recreate this project. I want this to be a .NET standard project, not an iOS project. So we'll bring this back. Add new project. Library. There we go. That's better. Use trip tracker.core. So a lot of people do tend to put these core classes right in their kind of their shared project, Biz Trip Tracker. I'll kind of go over that as we go, why I don't do that. Mainly unit testing. One other thing I want to do to this guy is I don't want core appended on everything. So we'll change this to root namespace. And I'll change the root namespace to be Biz Trip Tracker. Now it's not going to irritate me with putting core on everything as I create new files. So we've got our trip tracker, or trip ping. This will be the GPS. It's got an end time, a start time. Something else I wanted to do was the idea of a saved spot, I guess, for lack of a better term for now. See, no more core. And what I wanted the saved spot to be was kind of like there's one place that I go to frequently. Yeah, Warren Buffett. Note of time for the win. You don't really need note of time here though. In mobile, it's not the same. Like, I don't really have a requirement of dealing with time zones because I'll get the offset off the phone. So let the phone deal with it. Don't need note of time here because I'm not going to convert across time zones. So the idea of the save spot, what I wanted to do for this was, you know, if there's, you know, I often have to pay for parking, so I may want like a saved parking spot. Let's say parking price. I wanted also a time range for when this thing should fire, because obviously if I'm at home, I don't want this thing thinking, you know, it can fire off starting a trip. Like I may want this to actually start a trip when I leave the geofence or when I enter it. So I want to have a time range on this as well. So we'll do starting time range, ending time range, and we'll say, let's give it a description. Sure, we'll put GPS on this as well. So what my thinking is here is when you enter that saved spot or saved region or whatever the hell I'm going to call it at some point, is if it enters that spot, I either want it to start or stop a trip. So depending on the time range. So for instance, I may have when I'm leaving home in the morning, I'm probably 9 out of 10 times going to forget to start this button. Like I'm going to forget to start a trip. So I want it to automatically start a trip in this time range when I leave it. So we'll need a GPS, probably a geofence ID. Maybe I want a geofence ID, which is actually a string. And this can be nullable. And I'm just trying to think if there's any other cool things I want here. You know what? I'm going to put an enter time range. Or start time range. I'll explain what I'm doing here in a minute. Enter stop time range. So this could be if I'm entering the geofence at a certain time. So I want it to start, as long as it's within this range, it can either start or stop a trip. And same for if I'm leaving it. Start time range. Does anybody have any questions with regards to my madness here? I know what I'm doing, but not you guys may not know what I'm doing. So feel free to ask questions. All right, so I'm gonna call this, let's call it saved region. That makes a little more sense. So now what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna start to lay out the interfaces for how this puppy is gonna work. I don't really have anything cool to call this right now other than a trip service. That sounds good. And I wanna do one other thing. I'm going to create, I guess I'll call this app settings. And app settings are kind of persisted automatically by Shiny, which I'll show later. So I want to have a rolling kind of global settings, like I guess a rolling odometer would be good. I don't plan on having more than 2 billion kilometers, so let's do current odometer. Current estimated odometer. So what I wanted to do is kind of guess what my odometer is, and then I'll fix it one way or the other, just so the trips are set. Actually, that's a good thing to track. What's my starting odometer? Starting odometer. And I guess ending odometer. I could get this from the details, but the details are kind of more of a guess. And I'm also going to want to geocode this at some point, but we'll deal with that later. So we've got a ping, we've got a region, and I'm also probably going to store the current trip ID on here. Oh, let's make it proper though. Good, current trip ID. this guy should be nullable. That looks about right. Okay, so one of the reasons I like to create this core library is because what I'm going to do now is I'm going to create some, I'm going to create a data library. I haven't decided if I'm going to use SQLite. Probably most of you know SQLite out there. Kind of one of the up and comers, or one that a lot more people are using than I thought, was LightDB. I have yet to use LightDB in an active project, but it does look interesting. So I may actually try that for this project. But for now, let's go ahead and create. I want to start to create kind of the data service, or the service itself. So I'm going to create another .NET Standard library, and we'll just call this one, lack of a better term, we'll just call it BizTrack. Caps lock for the win. BizTripTracker.services. Well, we'll call it the trips. It's going to be basically the trip service. So we'll go ahead and create this guy. And eventually it should load this up. Hi, Copper Beardy, welcome. I'm going to reference this over. So one of my big reasons for doing this is usually I'm used to working in rather large teams. And one of the big things with working in big teams is you're almost always stepping on each other's toes with either CS Proj. Now it's not as bad as it used to be, obviously. But you know, you're competing for these code, like the code base. So I'm very big on separating it out. Sometimes these come in as NuGet packages. You know, cross-departmental stuff is working on this. Maybe you've got server libraries coming in, etc. So I've just been a big fan of separating this out. I've also been known to use one data library and then swap that out, performance, whatever. And with dependency injection, this is all pretty easy to do. So now I am going to bring in Shiny for this guy. Has anybody out there had a chance to do Shiny? Work with Shiny yet? Put notifications. So I'm going to bring in locations, obviously. I'm going to bring in notifications for later. One other thing I'd like to add is a reminder to stop trips. So if I have a trip that goes on for too long, that goes on for more than 2 hours, it should probably remind me that I'm recording time. So yeah, come on. So we'll say reminder minutes. So if you break the app up into modules, then you only need to add NuGet to that module that you're using it in. Usually you only need to add it to that module, but every once in a while, for instance, like Xamarin Forms. So Xamarin Forms is, for instance, it's installed in my core library where all my pages are going to be, as is Essentials, which I don't like it being there, but that's all right. I usually move Essentials elsewhere as well. Now, Forms is special. Usually I won't install like Shiny up here. Oh, did they not put Forms in here either? Yes, they did. Packages. There we go. So Forms is up here because it's got build scripts in it. So if you don't actually install Forms in your head projects as well, it won't run those build scripts, and then kind of weird stuff starts to happen. Now, in terms of Shiny, I'm pretty much only going to install it in my services, the services guy, and it will automatically go all the way through. There we go. This will automatically go through up to my biz tracker, and then basically anything referencing it. Now, one thing I haven't done is actually referenced my libraries here. So let's do, I'm going to reference core. Okay, so basically now everything will come up as soon. Oh, I gotta bring up services as well. Bring up services as well. So you'll notice that Shiny isn't actually in the NuGet packages in this project, but it is. Hopefully Xamarin Forms doesn't let me down today, or Visual Studio doesn't let me down. Let's see if it figures this stuff out. Shiny host and it. It hasn't figured it out yet. It's always the way it goes. Let's see if it can find. So we'll give that a minute to figure its stuff out. It is there. It's, oh, I'm in the Android project. Way to win. Yeah, so it hasn't figured it out yet. So what generally tends to happen is that this will bubble up through the, oh, you know why? Because I'm referencing the iOS project. Here we go. Let's bring, so I'm going to put core and services are in my biz tracker, and biz tracker is referenced by Android. So by that, this should be reading Shiny, but it's not right now. So we'll get back to that. But like I said, Xamarin Forms, you almost always have to take the reference on it. Obviously, the support packages are only ever going to exist in the head project. So, hey, Louis, how are you? And that should be that. So for the most part, I'm not going to have to really touch. Often what I'll do is I'll tuck these projects away. So we'll say, let's create a solution folder. Call this platforms. Very rarely have to go up into these guys other than the initial setup, which I haven't done, by the way, yet on this project. So I'll still have to do stuff like set up the permission, set up the provisioning profile, all that stuff, but I'm going to do that later. I really don't feel like doing that right now. I just kind of want to build some code. There we go, yep. So let's get rid of those guys. I don't want to see them for now. So this is generally where I'm going to do most of my work. So my trip service. I have a trip service, I have app settings, all that cool stuff. I have put trip reminder minutes, and a trip service. So I'm going to do I'll make this async just for argument's sake. Probably don't need to, but I'm going to do async. Async. There we go. Start trip. And we'll do async stop current trip. That looks all right. It's a good starting point anyways. It probably is going to have to change quite a bit, but let's start there. So let's go ahead and implement this guy. So trip service implementation. Now there's a whole bunch of cool kind of wacky stuff I need to add in here. So we're going to call this trip service implementation. I'm going to pull over that interface. It's hopefully going to figure itself out. I don't have a reference on that yet. Let's edit references. So the one downfall to working in kind of this enterprise architecture style is that you end up pulling references around a bit, whereas a lot of people just like to work in 3 projects or 4 if you're one of those unfortunate souls doing UWP. So I work in lots of projects, so I often forget to add references here and there, and you just have to kind of go figure it out. So, starting a trip. Well, you know what else I'm going to need to actually make this happen is a data service. So this is your typical repository style stuff that I'm setting up now. So we'll say task, I guess insert create trip. Actually, let's just do it like this. You can tell I've been in JavaScript world because everything's got to be fully named out, because it can't tell the difference. In a strongly typed land, I don't need to do that. I could even just make this object, but I was going to be a bit more explicit with what needs to be done. So we'll do trip ping. And I guess saved region. Saved region. So no idea how this guy's going to work right now, so we'll come back to that. And we're going to inject this guy. iTrip service. Oh, nope. iData service. So by doing this, what I've already managed to kind of get myself into is kind of abstracting out how my business layer is going to work. Have I used Prism DryOC forms extended with Shiny? No, I haven't. Dan has actually done a Shiny Prism library that extends the dependency injection from Shiny into Prism. We're still kind of working out the details, how that's totally going to work, but it's close. It's close. That'll probably come just after Shiny releases. Dan will push out. I am going to use DryOC for this implementation. I'm just not going to use Dan's library just yet. I'm sure he'll be, if he's on the stream, he'll swear at me later. It's fine. All right. So by doing this, what I've allowed myself to do is I can obviously bring all the Shiny stuff in, like the geofencing and any of that crazy stuff. But I can also have, like I said, I might do SQLite -net. I may do LightDB. I don't know. I don't care right now. I just, usually some other team will deal with that. You know, they want to try, I don't know, anybody tried some of those other crazy data libraries? Anybody using any crazy data libraries? It's like crickets out there. All right, in the meantime, let's new up a trip. So this is my data model, this is my domain model. It doesn't necessarily have to match my data model one-to-one. So once I get, say, a LightDB, you know what, let's just create the data library. I'll just do it now, so everyone can see what the craziness that I'm doing. So let's go ahead and add a project. Yes, this project will be in GitHub. I just created it, so it's not there yet. I'm also going to put kind of a roadmap there just so people can tell the stupid features I'm working on for this thing. And so I can remember them, because I'm literally kind of inventing this as we go. So we're going to call this data. And call this data service implementation. Once again, I have to reference that core library, which is fine. Using Azure Maps spatial APIs in your project. I haven't used that one actually. Not sure if that qualifies as a kind of a weird. It's kind of different. It's not really data storage, but so this guy. Data service implementation. And now I would, here is the case where I would reference probably just SQLite -net or LightDB, and it would only be a NuGet dependency that comes into this one library. And then obviously if I had massive problems with it, not that I'd have a massive problem with SQLite because it's pretty tried and true at this point, but I could yank it and put in LightDB or whatever. So for now, I'm gonna just, who cares? So the data model, the domain model is gonna come through, and if I have to save this different, say this doesn't have proper mapping on it, because with SQLite you have to put attributes on your models, which I'm not going to do. I'm kind of a purist like that. So if we go back to my core, I would not mark this up with SQLite attributes, because then I've got a hard dependency on SQLite. For some, that's all right. If you never plan to change it out, it's not really a big deal. But like I said, if you're working in big teams, you don't always get a say on kind of how those are going to work. So I like to do what's called building in a bubble. So I can design how I want my services and my actual domain to work with my app. And then, you know, all those guys that want to do some sort of over-engineered data sync, you know, let them deal with it. I don't care. I don't want to know how it works. Just save my data for me and allow me to get it. So I have my data. So let's go ahead and create a trip. I guess I'll be in charge of creating the IDs. And I'm going to say my start time is this. UTC. Doesn't matter. You know what? Let's save it as now. So that does have the time zone on it. And I will be inserting this. I just want to get this async right away. So we're going to go ahead and create this guy. And I'll make this async right away. So I'm not returning anything yet because I don't really know what I want to do with this yet. I'm just kind of framing out the basis. SQLite and blob storage. So you're hitting SQL Server, obviously not directly, right? You're going through an API. So let's take settings. Cool. All right, so I'm pulling in my app settings because these are like my rolling kind of global variables. Shiny has a really cool mechanism, which I'll try and take the time to show today. For storing this stuff, I don't need to press save. I don't need to tell it. I just need to set the variable and it'll remember it. So what I am going to do here is starting odometer. We'll do app settings, current estimated odometer, which I guess can be 0 for now. And then when I stop the trip, I'll make this async right away. I won't necessarily know the ending odometer yet. I'll get to that in a minute. But what I'll do is I'll say the current estimated odometer is, you know, whatever that end trip is. End of trip. And I'll store that here. So now I'd have to store the current trip too. So let's do current trip. Current trip ID. So I'm actually storing my current trip ID on the settings because if the app crashes, though these apps won't crash, right? They'll never crash because they'll be unit tested. But if, say my phone runs out of battery or the app crashes or yada, 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 I may want this thing to spin back up when the phone reboots or whatever, or it gets battery life again. And then I can say, oh, I already have a current trip ID. Let's try and get it going again. Or let's finish it. Maybe it's been, you know, 2 days. Hopefully I'm not still driving after 2 days, but I can start to rewind that again. And you can have apps that don't crash. I have, there's 2 apps I have in production. One's been running for about 6 months, and it has no crashes on it. It has some errors, but the app isn't actually crashing. So that is our app settings. What else do I want to do in this? So I've got my start time, my starting odometer, and a trip. Beautiful. Now what I want to do, for those of you that haven't used Shiny, I haven't showed how I kind of get Shiny wired up yet, but I'm not going to bother with that right now. What I want to start to do is my my event delegates. And what I'm going to do here is I want to listen for, let's say, geofence events when I get there. And I want to do, obviously, the GPS. That's kind of the big one for this, you would think. I'm going to mark these async because they don't need to crash right now. But they're not ready to be wired yet. And now the cool part is I can bring in my, well, whatever I need here. Because Shiny will be aware of these things. So I'm going to bring in my trip service. And I'm going to bring in, I guess, the data service for now. And what else do I need here? Let's bring in app settings too. Let's just bring the whole damn thing in. And restore all these guys. And app settings. Cool. So the wiring up with dry IOC, between Shiny and dry IOC, you almost won't even see it. You see it kind of in the, I mean, Dan does it for you in the Shiny Prism library. It's just kind of, you don't even see dry IOC. You never see it. It's just not something you will see in your code. Other than that, you'll see it only briefly in the Prism app file, Xamarin Forms application file. So the big one here is obviously I want to just in case my current trip is null. If my current trip is null, we're not going to do anything. Not sure why this would fire, but maybe we didn't turn the GPS off. So let's go ahead and create a new ping. Anybody have a better name for this? I feel like that's a dumb name, but GPS ping. So let's put latitude on this. And we'll do position, latitude, longitude. And obviously I need that trip ID, which the cool part here is I just literally said if it's null, don't use it. There we go. Now I can use it. And timestamp it. Time. So one of the cool things here, whoever was asking me about daytime offset, I can mark this as now. I can mark this as UTC now. One of the hard things that generally tends to happen with apps, if you store just date time in SQL Server, for example, you don't really know what time zone it is. Now, if you were smart, you stored it in UTC. If you just had like a general date time. But I've seen apps where they store like now, like your current time zone, and I have no idea how you would know that. But also, if you're in kind of North America, our time zones are messed up. Pretty much all time zones are messed up, but ours are particularly messed up. So, for instance, where I am right now, it may fluctuate between -4 hours and -5 hours, depending on the time of the year. So, just basically always store stuff in UTC or use an offset. And if you're really cool, like somebody said, no to time, you can actually save the time zone. For the purposes of this app, I don't need anything that complicated. So let's create our GPS. What do I call it? Let's save our ping. So that's it. So as the trip's rolling, Shiny's going to fire this little GPS reading. Once I start the GPS, obviously. And then I'll timestamp it. I'll say the latitude and the longitude. So this will actually be able to show me a progression on my trip, which is, again, something apparently the Canadian government likes to have. They want to make sure that, you know, if you're expensing gas, why did you expense so much? Well, Toronto traffic sucks, so I probably sat there for, 2 hours, so I burned a lot more gas. So deal with it. So this will prove it. That's one of the reasons I wanted to write this app. Hi, Danny. How are you? So we've got our reading. Let's actually make these. Let's store these for use for later, so we don't get some null reference exceptions. And that looks good. And we'll get to the geofencing later. I am going to use this, obviously, to start or stop a trip automatically. We'll get there when we get there. Oh, and one other cool thing I wanted to do was a reminder job. So we're going to put this as a job. So what I wanted to do was also, if I'm traveling for too long, and let's say I don't hit a geofence, or actually, you know what? I don't even need a job for this. I don't even really need a job for this. I'm going to simplify life. So if I'm traveling for too long and I forget to turn off, I forget to stop the job, I want it to send me a reminder to say, yo, Bozo, you forgot to turn off your trip and we're still logging time. So there's actually an easier way I can do that. And I'll show that here. So let's do, where's our trip service? There it is. So I have another thing in Shiny called the notification services. This is for local notifications before anybody asks. I should probably spell that right. Beautiful. And I'll store this guy. Notifications. So what I'm going to do when I start a trip, I'm going to actually set, no, first I'll say if I have a trip reminder time, trip reminder minutes is not null. Let's do reminder time. Date, time, offset, UTC now, add minutes, trip reminder minutes, dot value. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to tell my notification manager to send this in the future. So we'll say the scheduled time is the reminder time to local time. Can even make this a little bit cooler, a little bit easier. There, now I don't even need to cast it. So local, obviously the schedule date is in local time because it's relative to your device. The OS figures the rest of it out. And we'll figure out something clever to say. Okay, and then what I'll do, obviously, when I'm stopping the trip, I can cancel the reminder. We'll just blanket statement this, cancel all. Or whatever it is, cancel. Clear, there we go. Usually I wouldn't blanket statement this, I wouldn't cancel all notifications, but for now, it's nice and easy. One thing is I can pass in a notification ID and then cancel that notification ID. Actually, why don't we do that? I'll just do that. Except I don't have an int. Forget it for now. I'll come back. All right, so I've triggered a notification. I've put a scheduled time on it. So in, let's say, 2 hours, it's going to roll through and it'll send that notification if I forget to stop my trip. And then if I do actually click that button and I remember to click that button, I'll just clear the notification and it'll never fire. So that's pretty cool. I didn't even need a job. It's kind of disappointing. I wanted to build a job, but there's actually the way Shiny works with notifications for UWP and Android is I actually use jobs to fire the local notifications. Android does have built-in timers to fire your notifications, but it kind of sucks. And UWP, we won't even talk about its it screwed up notification mechanism. So I actually do use a job internally that fires every few minutes and figures out if notifications have to run. Okay, so let's go back. All right. Anybody have any questions? It's pretty quiet out there. You can always DM me and tell me if I'm crazy or you really don't understand a thing I'm doing. Okay, so let's go ahead and finish this stop trip. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to pull. Well, let's make sure I don't do anything stupid. Current trip ID is null. You can't close anything off. Otherwise, data. Now I'm already missing some methods here, so I need to add to my data service. I need to be able to get a trip. Get trip by ID. And we'll say GUI trip ID. Nope. And then maybe I want to actually return the trip. Beautiful. So now, again, not knowing how it works because I don't want to know how the data works. Maybe this is all online. Get trip by ID. Using the current trip ID. And that's a nullable. And we'll say if the trip's here. If the trip is null, oh damn, something's really screwed. And actually, I just noticed that I would have actually caused this bug because I didn't nullify this. There we go. Beautiful. So now we're going to say trip. We'll try and guess the ending odometer later once I know how to actually put that through. And we'll say trip end time is equal to daytime offset dot now. Wicked. That's pretty cool. I think that'll work. Obviously, I just got to figure out the ending odometer. One step at a time. Actually, you know what? Why don't I just pass it through? So when I'm stopping the trip. When I'm stopping the trip, I'll have the last ping. So I need the last ping. Okay, let's do that. Nope. Okay. So now in my data service, I want to add one more call. Trip ping. Get last ping for by trip. And now we'll say await this data get last trip trip.id. And well, I know the starting odometer, so, and I know this, I almost need the first and the last trip. I don't want to make two data calls for that. So what I'm trying to do now is I want to get the beginning of the trip and the end of the trip, and then I want to calculate the mileage out of that, and then I want to stick that on my starting odometer, or sorry, my ending odometer, and I want to put that on my current estimated odometer. That's what I want to do. So I really need okay, I'm going to do this stupid for now and I'll change this later. Really, I should do one call. You know what? No, I'm going to do one call. Let's do two trip pings. Value tuple. No, forget it. Now I don't want to bring out all of the pings for a trip because I think what I'm going to do is I'm going to track these GPS coordinates every, let's say 10 seconds. So if I'm driving an hour So that's roughly, what, 6 pings every minute. Yeah, I don't want to pull all that data out. So we'll just do the first and last. So we'll do last. Yes, I realize I could do a when all here, but just for brevity's sake, I'm going to do this the hard way. So we'll do trip ID. So I know my first ping, the starting point. I know my last ping. And so now I should be able to calculate distance. Now Shiny actually has positioning miles built into it. So I'm going to use that. Come on. So I'm going to turn this back into a position. That. And GPS long. And let's do start, end, position. Nope. Last. Ooh, let's make sure we get the right numbers here. And last GPS longitude. All right, so now I can say distance, end, let's do start, get distance to end, and I can actually return this in total kilometers, total meters, total miles. You know, for all you Americans, sorry, you guys are the only ones doing old metric system or old imperial system. The rest of the world, I'm pretty sure we're all up to date with easy numbers to work with. So I now have my total kilometers for the trip, and I know what my starting odometer was. So I can say trip starting odometer plus total kilometers. What doesn't it like here? Starting odometer is, and this is double, right? It's going to be double, guaranteed. Yeah, of course it is. Why wouldn't it be? So let's do trip ending odometer. It's fine, it's fine. Here, we'll do it smart. 2 and 32. I actually wonder, I probably should store this. Yeah, this should be a double. This should be a double. So basically, you know, you may travel half a kilometer, you may travel half a mile, so I want to be able to track that stuff. So we'll get rid of this. I don't need to convert it anymore. So I now know my ending odometer, and I'll also put that on my current estimated odometer. Oh, and I got to change that too. So let's go to implementation and change. Double. What don't you like here? So let's save that. Okay, you're fine with that. App settings. Current estimated odometer is also double. Trip.ending odometer. Beautiful. Almost beautiful. Ah, it's because it's null. There we go. Okay, so I got the first ping. So when our GPS started recording coordinates of where the trip is starting, I got my last ping. So the last GPS ping that I had before I actually called this method. And I basically turned the first into a position, so GPS coordinates, the end into a position, and then I'm able to calculate the distance between the start and the end. Now this isn't perfect actually, but it's good enough for now. It's good enough for now only because it's close. but the coordinates between start and end are actually like point to point, and that's bad. Because obviously I'm kind of shooting myself in the foot, because point to point across is very linear, and obviously faster to go in a straight line than it is to go kind of the jagged roads we take. So I'm actually kind of killing myself doing this. But I'll just mark this as this sucks. So probably what I actually have to do, I think I actually do have to pull out all the trips, all the pings, and then calculate the distance between each ping. I'll do this later. Nobody wants to watch me fix all my bugs, right? The distance between every ping. So what I would do is basically I would say, get me all pings. Why not use the Google Maps SDK for this? Well, a couple reasons. One is this is going to run in the background. I usually don't have the one app open. I could kind of put these plot points back in, like back into Google Maps and then calculate it after. But kind of what I want to do is this calculates, gets saved to a backend, and may come out in a spreadsheet. I may dump it into QuickBooks, fantastic software if you use it. So I may dump all of that data in, so it probably won't be calculated, or I won't be able to feed it to a service where that can be calculated. So I want to calculate this all here, and it's actually pretty easy to do, because I don't necessarily care. Like I may have to show these points on a map, but it's more or less tracking, okay, well, look, I went to all these points at these times. I'm expensing this kind of gas because I did these kind of trips, etc. So it's not really so much about showing this on a map and then figuring it out. It's because I need this data to be calculated. Does that make sense? Good. So I just did this kind of quickly, and I've already introduced a bug. One that I'm going to lose out on, because I don't want to pay the government. I don't want to pay them inappropriately anyways. All right. So, and I better save my trip now. So you're going to do your own distance for this, right? What do you mean I'm going to do my own distance for this? Let's change this into save. Algorithm to calculate the distance with the cost. No, I'm not going to put the cost in necessarily. What it's going to do is I'll have my starting and ending odometers on these trips. So I'll be able to figure out, okay, well, my starting odometer at the beginning of the year was this. My ending odometer is this. I used this many kilometers that I tracked for business. And here's the gas I'm expensing, and then they let the government figure it out. I did the due diligence of giving them very precise data. They can figure out if I've calculated the gas properly or perfectly. You know what I mean? I'm meeting them halfway. I feel like I'm helping them out. So if they want more, then, give back. A little bit of kickback. It probably won't end up working like that, but yeah, they can figure it out. Okay, so now I want to save my trip, obviously, because I've updated it. I'm going to wait that. And so I don't like having an insert and an update. I think it's like, I hate CRUD for that. Here's an insert, update, delete, blah, 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 blah. Just, you figure it out. I gave you an ID. You let me know if you need to save it or whatnot. So there we go. So I've done a bug. Fine. We'll come back and fix that. We'll unit test it later. Now, what else did I want to do here? I wanted to do kind of a geofencing So that's my start and my stop trip, obviously. Now I am going to get into pressing buttons later with forms and using Prism and ReactiveUI. We'll get there. For now, what I want to do is I want to save. So what I want to do is create my geofence with a starting point or an ending point. And when I'm either leaving that place, I want it to figure out if it needs to start a trip or send me a notification that I need to start a trip, etc. So now I just need to figure out how I want to do that. So let's do create, what did I call it? Create a saved region. So now one thing that people tend to do is obviously pass these directly to their data service, but I actually want to put the data service in behind the trip service as much as possible. So the trip service is actually going to figure out, okay, you're creating this guy. I got to go and create the geofence. I got to go in, maybe create some notifications, etc. And it's going to wire up all that stuff. So I don't want to put this through the data service. So let's do create, and obviously I'll add a delete, remove saved region. Remove saved region. And let's do this by ID. Saved region ID. Good. Good. So now this guy's going to be complaining that I haven't implemented new methods. That's great. So how are we going to do this now? So obviously I need to bring a few more things in here. We need my GPS manager. And I need my geofence manager. Lots of services coming in here, which isn't necessarily a bad thing. It's just something to be aware of. More services you have, the harder it is to unit test. So let's save those guys. Geofence manager. Great. Oh, and I did forget one thing. Obviously, if I'm starting a trip, let's make sure that that GPS gets going right after that. I should ask permissions. I'll deal with that later. One thing we'll do here is we'll start the listener and we'll say GPS request of. So I think one thing I said is I want this to fire every 10 seconds. From seconds. So if you fire the GPS in real time, it'll actually, iOS can really flood that data in. So I think I've seen it come in as fast as 4 times a second. Obviously, I don't want to track that much for the government. They don't need to know where I'm going pee, but they definitely can see 10-second intervals because then they'll see kind of turns and all that stuff. Yes. Got to remember to turn off those instant messengers before you start streaming. Okay, so I started my listener on my start new trip, and over here I will stop it. Great. Okay, so for the saved region, obviously the first thing I'm going to do is, yes, I am going to hand this over to the data manager. Let me turn this into a save. Where's my data manager? Let's change this into save, and we'll also turn this into, let's turn this into delete or remove. So one of the things that's also really cool is you can see how I can start to frame out all my data service calls without actually having to go and implement them. Like I'm able to just get away with writing the logic because nobody wants to see me sit there and map up SQLite or LightDB. That's pretty boring shit. I don't want to do it. So I can do this offline later. So let's go ahead and do, oh, actually I'm going to pass this right off. Okay, so we're going to await that. Now, there's one other thing I'm going to do here is I'm actually going to say if it's GPS latitude, GPS longitude, and a description. Okay, great. So I'm going to create a geofence. I'm going to create a geofence for this. And we're going to do start monitoring. I'm going to give this a geofence region. And our center point, so where we're starting our radius from, so we draw a circle for a geofence, is going to be from this point. So wherever my region is, GPS latitude, GPS longitude, we're going to give this an this is constructor args. There we go. This an identifier of, let's do region. We'll just piggyback on the region ID. This is a nice thing when you're working with these data models. You're able to kind of set, like I'm just able to reuse the IDs, and then with the geofence fires, I can just say, oh, this is the geofence identifier that's firing. Great, let's get that data model and start working with it. Have I ever had the need to make starting points with irregular shapes? Yes, once. And I wish I hadn't have done it this way. There was a case where you were crossing state boundaries in the United States. So there were certain laws that applied as you cross those state boundaries. But setting those shapes up was, first of all, it doesn't really work on. It didn't really work on Android at the time, so we were kind of mocking that through, and iOS was a pain to do that. I don't even think it did that properly at the time either. So honestly, at that point, it was easier to just do geofence and keep asking, "Are we in the same state? Are we in the same state? Oh, we're not in the same state. What state are we in now? Okay, we need to change the laws up and maybe send a notification." So it actually became easier to do geofence in that case than try and set up irregular shapes, because the irregular shapes, they're painful. Another thing to be aware of with geofencing that I have to be careful with here too is on iOS you only get 20. You get 20 geofences. That's it, not a penny more. And if you go beyond that, it just errors. So if apps like this, like I'm using geofences in this app more or less to get the app spinning. So okay, I'm leaving my home, start the trip, which in turn means kick off the GPS and start tracking my ass all the way to work. And then vice versa, when I get to the parking, I'm going to say, okay, well, I've arrived at this spot. Let's create a parking record. Let's stop the GPS. Let's record our stop end trip. So it's more or less to start and stop, but I'm not using them beyond that. And we'll say the distance. So the other thing about geofences is I find the best distance is roughly about 100 meters from your target. That's quite wide when you think about it, but it's pretty much within 100 meters, you're almost guaranteed that your geofence is going to fire reliably. If you go under that, it's kind of hit or miss. So if you're expecting it to fire the second you leave within 50 meters, you're kind of playing with your life on that one. So I generally tell people, don't go less than 100 meters, because it's not guaranteed it's going to work out in your favor. Okay, so we've created our geofence. One thing I am going to do is, if I'm stupid here and I do, did I reuse the region here? If the region, oh, I did put a geofence identifier on here, but I'll delete that in a second. If this is empty, just create it, just in case. Okay, and obviously in my saved region now, I'm going to nuke this guy because I don't need it. And save the lat long. Start parking price. Beautiful, beautiful. Okay, so I'm going to create my geofence, and when I delete this, let's make this async. Delete the data. Data remove. Yeah, I didn't really give this a nice name, did I? Get tripped by ID. Ooh, I don't even have a get by ID there. Way to fail. Let's add. Move save region. Let's do saved region. Get saved region by ID. Yeah, I'm gonna need that anyways. And then we'll do remove. Yeah, I'm gonna just double this up. Anybody have any questions so far? If I'm rambling and you don't know what I'm doing, don't be afraid to ask. I am watching the chat, like I said. So I'm going to get that out of data and get saved region by ID. I should check it for null, but for now we'll just do this. We're just going to cheat. Okay. And we're also going to shut down the geofence. So this .geofence manager, stop monitoring on. Now I realize I've got this stop monitoring on the geofence object itself. I really need to put this on the ID for this. This is really all I need out of this is the ID. So I'm going to cheat this and say distance. So this is a problem I am preparing to deal with, is that you're stopping monitoring on an ID. I don't have to pass the entire geofence object because I only care about the first parameter, which is the identifier. Saved region ID to string, and the center new position. What don't you like? 0, 0. Here we go. Great. So when we remove the region, go and find it, remove it from the database, and kill the geofence because it doesn't need to fire anymore. When we're creating a saved region, all we got to do is make sure we save that data and start the geofence. That's it. It's pretty easy. And now we'll go back to our actual, our delegates. Again, these are the events that Shiny is going to fire through for us. So now, I'm going to change this to saved. Now when this guy goes ahead and fires, I'm going to say go ahead and get from the database, get, what do we call this? Get by region ID. And we know that we're using the identifier. We know that our identifier is good. I could safety this, but we won't for now. One thing, if anybody's wondering, Shiny does protect the delegates. So if your delegate does do kind of crashy code, which we don't do that, right? Nobody crashes. But if you do have a crash in your delegate method, Shiny has an internal logger, because obviously if this method crashes, maybe you're doing like a remote call that you didn't safety or whatever, Shiny will log that as an error for you. It won't actually allow your app to crash. And if you do find a place where Shiny didn't protect it, all you got to do is file a bug and I'll make sure that gets fixed. But as far as I know right now, I've got that safety pretty much everywhere. Okay, so we'll make sure that the region's not null at least. We'll do some safetying of code. And we'll say, okay, well, what time is it now? UTC now. So when this region comes out, if it's, how do I want to do this? Basically what I want to do here is say, if it's between this time region of entering, actually I guess that's the starting point. What are we doing? Are we entering this bloody geofence or are we leaving it? Yes. That's what I forgot to do. Presenter mode for the win. There we go. I'm kind of new at this streaming stuff, so when my wife messages me, just ignore her messages. That's what I'm doing right now. This is recorded, but she doesn't watch my stream, so I don't have to worry about it. She doesn't like my nerd stuff. Works well, because when I say stupid stuff like that, I don't get busted for it. So back here, I wanted to go back to the trip service for 1 second. So right here, I'm saying, okay, whenever a geofence fires, if I'm entering it, what am I doing? Otherwise, I must be exiting it. One thing you can do with the geofences, now these are the required arguments. You need to have the ID, you need to know where the center point is, and you need to know the distance around to create the fence. But you may also want to have, there's some additional arguments. Maybe I only want this fence to fire once. Obviously I don't in this case, but maybe I only want it to fire when I'm entering or exiting. I could do that here. I just don't want to, because I'm really not sure how I want this to work yet. So we're going to go back to our delegate. So if we're entering it, and if the saved region's enter time is null, then we're not doing anything. Or the saved region's enter time is less than the starting time. Then I want to go ahead and do something here. So also, if the current ID, hang on, let's do this. If we're entering it and the current trip ID, if the current trip ID is null, then who cares? Because we're entering it. It's only when we're exiting that the current trip ID can be. So what I'm just trying to figure out here is if the geofence fires when I'm entering a geofence, if the trip ID is null, then I don't want to do anything. Because there's nothing to do. I'm not in a trip. And if I am entering it, and it's in my enter start, and it's in the time range, I'm going to come back to this. And in entered time range, do the thing. So these are my absolute non-fire conditions. So if I'm not tracking the start time and I'm not in a current trip, just get out. Who cares? Nothing's going to happen. If I'm in the time range, so I have a start time range and therefore I have an end time range. If I'm between that, then I want to actually stop the trip. So here is where I would do trip service dot stop current trip. Yes. I think that's right. We'll unit test that later just to prove it. I am known to throw a few bugs here and there. Okay, and I'll do time range later. For now, that's good. So if we're exiting, so I'm leaving my house. If I'm exiting that time range, or I'm leaving the office for the end of the day, so I don't have a trip. So I don't want this to fire. This is now the opposite condition. So if my current trip, I do have a current trip, then get out. don't run. Otherwise, let's we'll do time ranges again. Time range. Start the trip. Wait, this dot trip service dot start current. Start new trip. Does that make sense to everybody? I'm not even making sense to myself sometimes, so. So we'll do time ranges later. So let's do static is in time range. And we'll give it a saved region. And this is for entry. Now what I'll do is I'll say no if is in time range region, and this is for entry. Oh, saved region. Saved region. Do the thing. Not saved region. And false. This is not for. So if the current trip is empty, you know what, I'll put that in time range as well. Or not in time range. One thing I don't like doing is negations, but for this one it's fine. So if not null or not in time range. So let's do so if the current trip ID isn't null, we've entered the geofence and we're in the time region, stop the current trip. If the current trip is empty and we're still in that time range, start the trip. And we'll do one other thing. Awesome. Does that make sense to everybody? It's a little crazy, but it's going to work. Maybe with a little bit of fixing it'll work. But. So that's it. I will go through the art of kind of mapping up Shiny really quick. So I'm going to do, what are we going to call this? What did I call this? Biz Trip Tracker. Sometimes my naming conventions for my apps aren't very good. So this one, Biz Trip Tracker, is not my best. I feel like I hit pretty good with Shiny, but this Biz Trip Tracker is kind of, it sucks. So we'll do Shiny Startup. And let's see here. So I'm basically just going to show you how to configure these things. At least from this point, the apps I'll save, all the app wiring and permissions I'll save for, I guess, the next broadcast. So we're going to go ahead and use GPS, and I'm going to give it my GPS. Oh, what did I call it? So I did end up using the same class, event. What do I call it? Event delegates. I used the same class for both my geofencing and my GPS. It is going to create two instances of the class, but the reason I did this is because pretty much the dependency chain between geofencing and GPS is pretty much the same. I'm using the app service or the app settings. I'm using the data service, so I'm at least using 2 of the services there. Down here, I'm pretty much using app settings, data service, and trip service. So I'm using all 3 down here. So just for kind of ease of use, I'm kind of shoving them all into one class. So let's do uses geofencing, and that'll be the same thing, event delegates. And last but not least, I did use notifications. Now, the one thing, in order for Shiny to use my trip service, my data service, whatever that ends up being, I need to register those here. But I'm not really registering Shiny where it needs to be registered yet. I'm going to cover that kind of in the next kind of broadcast that I do. And then I'll go through some of the configuration and how these things work. And I'll probably also have like a SQLite or a LightDB mapping at that point that'll allow us to kind of go further without sitting here watching me map up data classes. But that's it. That's all I'm going to do for today. I kind of wanted to just frame out the ideas and show kind of some of the easy ways to work with geofencing, to work with GPS. Yeah, that's it in a nutshell. It is pretty easy. But again, I'll show some other cool things, and I will be doing the UI with Prism and ReactiveUI probably next week. So I am hoping to start doing these every Friday. I know I've said that in the past, but it is actually a planful thing now. So yeah, come out and check it out. I will put on my blog for those that are interested. There we go, bot. I will put on my blog kind of the next upcoming posts if you're interested in seeing what I have to build. So thanks everybody for coming. Is there any questions before I kind of hop off the stream? I've never actually done a raid, so I am going to raid James because he's just starting up. Oh, you want the dry IOC registration on the app? Yeah, no problem. I'll get that in the. I'll plan for that in the next one. Remind me if I forget. Any other questions before I hop off? Okay, I think we're going to go and raid James. James has been a pretty big supporter of Shiny and kind of the open source community lately, so I want to go and. I haven't done one of these raid things, so let's see what happens. Let me just turn this off. So thanks everybody for coming.